Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
This is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streaming every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Well, it's daylight time, thank God. Facebook, X, YouTube, and Rumble. Tonight, the Forest Service starts what they call a prescribed burn. It gets out of control and burns down your house and your barn. They say to you, oops, so sorry, bud. Is that okay with you? Well, probably not. It wouldn't be with me. So what do you need to know about the laws that are supposed to be protecting your property and your life against government malfeasance? The United States is a constitutional republic with three founding documents. The Declaration of Independence states the philosophy of the founders. The Constitution is the shop manual for how the federal government is supposed to run. The Bill of Rights defines the relationship between the federal government, the states, and you and me. So here are some useful facts. The first sentence in Article 1 of the Constitution is, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Dig that. The Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And how about the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law prohibiting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and, this is important, to petition the government for redress of grievances. Here's how those facts relate to the problem I posed. We live in a tyranny of the bureaucracy right now. Congress has given unelected, untouchable bureaucrats the power to make rules and regulations that have the force of law over you and me. Administrative law was designed to guarantee that bureaucrats have the upper hand against we the people. Try fighting anything in an administrative hearing. You'll figure that out in a hurry. The Fifth Amendment requires public use and just compensation. Very imprecise and debatable concepts that allow the judicial system to determine and justify the mechanisms that government can use to steal your property. We are allowed to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Get this in the beginning, folks. You could actually go directly to Congress, on the floor of Congress, and petition the government for a redress of grievances. You could actually do that. You submitted a paper, you said, well, come here at 11 o'clock, and you could talk to Congress and say, this is what you did to me, I don't like it, how about fixing it? But then the government passed the 11th Amendment, which, combined with numerous subsequent court cases, solidified the concept of sovereign immunity, by which you cannot sue the government unless, get this, it agrees to be sued. Well, that's a no-brainer for them, but unfortunately, it puts a roadblock for us. The practical reality is that government can use eminent domain to take your land for anything even vaguely considered public usage and pay you what they want. In addition, governments can restrict land use, remove development rights, impose environmental limitations, designate conservation areas, and reduce your land value to almost zero without formally taking the land. And owners still pay property taxes, maintenance, and liability, while economic value may be largely gone. But what about wildfires that destroy private property and cause injury and death? I'm talking about wildfires that are purposely set and natural wildfires purposely enhanced by the government, Land agencies like the BLM, Forest Service, and Park Service, they set these fires, enhance them for what they call forest management. What about that? Well, fortunately, my guest on Freedom Forum Live today can answer those questions and even more. Joe Redden, welcome as a guest on Freedom Forum Live.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. It's my pleasure to be here. And yes, it was a great introduction on this quandary of how fire can go uncompensated by the federal government, and your property is all gone, including your house.
Well, Joe, let me tell everybody a little bit about you so they know that that cowboy hat actually has some meaning. Joe Redden is the chief forester and owner of Flexus Forestry LLC, a Durango, Colorado-based consulting forestry firm established in 2017. Flexus Forestry, and I'm telling you right now, go check them out, check their website out, use them if you need advice on anything that has to do with trees and forests. They're your people. Flexus Forestry LLC has served private landowners in Colorado, New Mexico, and California by producing forest plans and wildfire impact assessments to develop landowners' forest management strategies and provide options for forest management, fuels management, and mitigation. Joe and his company are motivated to meet the forest management needs of forest landowners. But Joe Redden didn't get there just in 2017. You can tell he's been around for a little bit longer than that. Joe Redden served in the USDA Forest Service for 38 years with the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program across 14 states, from Kentucky to Maine. He worked on national forests in Oregon, Utah, and New Mexico, and at the national office as a congressional liaison, where he gained extensive policy experience with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. He retired as the assistant director of the Forest Management Directorate in Washington, D.C. For 30 years, Joe served as a federal wildland firefighter, division supervisor, incident commander T3, and agency administrator. I'm almost out of breath talking about you, Joe. And so I'm going to ask you, Joe Redden, why are we burning down our forest now and calling it forest management? I want to know the answer.
Well, Dan, my hat is coming off because my head got too big on that introduction. But having said that, yeah, it's a good question, right? Fire is not really considered a forest management tool. And matter of fact, my former agency, the U.S. Forest Service, started in 1905. Its purpose for the Western forest, and I'm talking west of the Mississippi River, west of the 100th meridian, the idea was to have that under federal utilization management rather than caretaker management, and bring both the science and the art of silviculture, forestry, right, cutting trees, regrowing trees and everything, and at the same time suppressing fires. And we've wandered far away from the original legislation that established the forest reserves. And as you said in your introduction, that about Congress and so forth, Congress specifically went to great pains in 1897 to study the forest reserves, because they had been established in 1870, or 1897 is when the Forest Reserve Act was passed. But in 1891 is when the forest reserves were set aside, and they were sort of in a limbo, and Congress decided to act. But before acting, they commissioned a study. And they went to, the study was run by the National Academy of Sciences, and people traveled to different countries, and they interviewed different European and Asian countries that were practicing forestry. And they were very, very comprehensive. They looked at organizations and who should run them and what kind of education and everything. But the one thing that was unique to the American system was the suppression of fires. And there's actually a book, a report that's part of the federal record for the Organic Administration Act of 1897 that details and sets the purpose of suppressing fires. So how do we wander so far away?
Well, that's a good
that
question.
administrative law you talked about.
Right. That is administrative law. So, what you've said so far, and I don't know if you'll disagree or not, but forest management now has really turned into forest destruction by fire, is it not?
It has. I mean, classic example, if any of the listeners have spent any time in northern Arizona on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, well, if you go back this year, don't look for the lodge because it fell apart from the Dragon Bravo fire. It was completely burned down and a national landmark. And who knows if it will ever get rebuilt. But it's a case that didn't have to happen. The Dragon Bravo fire was named after the actual Dragon Fire of 2023. So Bravo being the second version of it, sort of a 2.0. And it was in the burn path or burn scar of the Dragon Fire. And the National Park Service let this fire, as Dan said in his introduction, go as a managed fire. And a managed fire doesn't mean that the firefighters sit around on their shovels and Pulaskis. They actually take out drip torches and drones and start to light more fire. And in one of the windiest places in North America, the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, known as the Arizona Strip to locals, that big winds came up and blew the fire, became the largest fire in 2025 at 145,000 acres that were burned, and it burned out of the jurisdiction of the Park Service into the National Forest, which is the Kaibab National Forest, and it also burned down through the rim of the Grand Canyon on the north rim, and the Colorado River became the South Fire Line. Now, to me, that's not forestry. That's not conservation. That's just wanton destruction.
Well, what you said is really it. Didn't that fire also burn down the lodge itself? This is a famous landmark that's been there for years and years. Here, these guys, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just am exasperated when I hear this lodge was there. It was a beautiful old lodge. People used to go there for vacation and all that stuff. And wasn't there an animal there, or a statue of an animal? What was that animal called?
I don't recall the animal. Sorry,
but here's this beautiful lodge burned down by a wildfire that was enhanced on purpose as part of fire management. I mean, go figure that one out.
I know it's something that didn't have to happen, and I actually like the Forest Service, which has the Organic Administration Act of 1897. The Park Service has an Organic Administration Act of 1916 when it was founded. And actually, I went this summer and read the Organic Administration Act for the Park Service, and it actually allows timber sales in the park, but it says nothing about fires. So, timber, fire, okay. Yes, they both can kill trees or use trees, and one is fuel and one is lumber products. But there is nothing in the law that says that the Park Service is relieved of suppressing fires and can actually use fires as a management tool. And what's in the law is what an agency is allowed to do. If it's outside of the law, if the law is silent on it, then the agency can't do that. That's how our laws work. But again, administrative law and most congressmen and women don't even know about the Organic Act for the National Park Service. So they're running on their own headlights and not following the law.
So what's happening basically is the Forest Service and the Park Service are ignoring the stated legal purpose, or one of the stated legal purposes of their actual being. And that is, if forest fires occur, wildfires occur, their job is to put them out. That
Right.
seems pretty simple to me. What do you think?
Well, and I'll go back to the 1897 Organic Administration Act and give a little background, like I did with, the report and so forth. So that report was summarized in the 1897 Organic Administration Act with a passage where it says, the secretary shall protect the forest reserves from fire and depredations. Okay. And what that means is, especially depredations, that meant the stealing of timber. Okay. Because there was, settlers moving in, and they would just go to the forest reserves and take trees, and even mill companies would do that. So that was called depredation. That was stealing the timber. The Forest Service's Organic Administration Act actually allows for timber harvesting, and laws have two things. One is non-discretionary, with words like shall. The secretary shall protect the forest. Some words are discretionary. The secretary may cut timber, and if they cut timber, the timber has to be old, large, or dead, and it has to be, each piece of timber, whether it's dead or alive, has to be individually marked and then appraised and sold at a high bid auction. And in 1975, the Forest Service in West Virginia, the Monongahela National Forest, the Forest Service there was clear cutting. And the clear cutting was not mentioned in the Organic Administration Act. It said individual tree selection, not large groups of trees or acres of trees. And they were doing 40 to 80 to 100 acres of clear cutting at a time. And what they were doing was marking the boundaries, but the trees inside the boundary of that clear cut harvest were neither old, large, or dead, nor were they individually marked. And it came to the attention of the Isaac Walton League of West Virginia. And the Isaac Walton League sued the Secretary of Agriculture for failure to follow the Organic Administration Act of 1897. And the judge was a good judge. He believed in what was written in the law was what the Congress intended the executive branch to do. And he found through testimony that the Forest Service had violated the Organic Administration Act. And this is very common now, where a federal judge, a district judge, will put in a nationwide injunction on something, immigration or deportation, or the right for the president to not allow immigrants to come in from some other country that he has deemed to be a danger to the United States. But back in 1975, a nationwide injunction on forestry matters was exceptionally rare, and that covered all of the national forest system in 42 states in Puerto Rico, because that's where the Forest Service has the national forest, in 42 of the 50 states in Puerto Rico. And so that was shut down for a couple of years, that injunction, while the government tried to appeal it, but the appeals court sided with the district court, and then the administration, and it was the Ford administration, they were left with the only recourse was to go to Congress. And to resolve that, they passed the National Forest Management Act, and President Ford signed that in the fall of 1976, just as he was losing his election to President Carter. And with the with the passage of the National Forest Management Act, when you look at the National Forest Management Act, the only time that you can see fire in that act is when it describes damage to the forest assets of timber, water, wildlife, forage or rangeland, and and fisheries. Okay, those are the enumerated by law multiple uses of, oh, and recreation too, for the Forest Service. And fire is detrimental to all of those that I just mentioned.
Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me is they've been in the news in the last several years, a number of wildfires burned out of control and have done significant destruction of property and life. I think one was called the Pass Fire, which I remember. I can't remember all the names, but I know a number of people died in that fire. And there are numerous fires in California and the like where there's a lot of property damage. What are we to do about that kind of situation? Why does that occur, first of all? I mean, I'm sure there's been fire in the forest forever and ever. But on the other hand, um, why is it sort of happening now and people are dying and losing their homes? What's going on now that has brought all this to public attention?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. And you take a state like California, the real estate agent's motto in California to a prospective home buying couple was drive until you can qualify. And California is a long but narrow state along the coast. And so people in like the North Bay area, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, young couples were forced to head out east past Sacramento and go up into the Sierras. And there's a lot of private land in there, and that land was, cheaper, and yet it was still within the California commuting distance of, and so they
5 hours.
Yeah, 5 hours, right? I drive 5 hours, I work 8 hours, I drive another 5 hours, and I'm home in the house for just a short period of time until I got to go back again. It's like time to make the donuts from that old commercial. So there's that social pressure, right? And then of course there's affluence pressure too. Folks, make a good living, and they build a good nest egg, and they say, hey, what's really valuable is land, and I'm going to move out to the land, and I'm going to live out there, but the land is all forested, and there's a shortage of foresters like myself to manage the lands, and folks don't know, they come from the city. Oh, we should never cut a tree. We should, we need to be cutting these trees, and we need to be using them and utilizing them. And I'm not saying in a clear cut fashion, but individual tree selection fashion. And we need to, it's like your garden. You have to go and weed every week, and even cull some of the vegetables that you're growing to allow for more growing space. Some are not as healthy as others. And so there's all reasons why you want to do that. And I liken it to your vegetable and flower garden that you have at your house. You're always tending that. Well, our forest should always be tended. So that, and then there has been some charismatic megafauna, like the northern spotted owl. Great picture of that little bird on the cover of Time magazine back in the late 80s. And that's what basically killed forest management within the Forest Service. When the owl got listed in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. And by the way, there are barred owls in North Carolina. The barred owl is now mating with the northern spotted owl. Their Strix is their genus. Okay, they have they're just a little bit species-wise different, but I liken it to an Irish kid marrying an Italian girl. You're still Catholic, and And so you get viable offspring and all of that kind of stuff. But the government now is killing these owls, and they're killing the barred owls, and they're killing the mixed, okay, barred and spotted owl offspring. They're killing them too, in sort of a ethnic cleansing type of thing that we saw back in Croatia in the 90s. And this is part of the best government money can buy. But when the the spotted owl got listed, that drove the timber business out of the forest and out of the national forest. And then mills closed up, and there was a great amount of family wage jobs. And I mean, I'm emphasizing this, family wage jobs in the rural communities where people made very good money. They were able to afford nice homes. They had nice trucks, and now they're all unemployed. And this is their homestead. This is where they live. This is where their family is. They're not going to move. And their kids moved out, but the people, the older people that in their 40s to 60s that were let go during that time in 1991, they stayed in their communities, but there's no work. And the population has skewed over. And you probably see that, Dan, in your county, with the people who are native to your county. Now you get the Atlanta and the Charlotte new people moving in and so forth, and that does help the county a little bit, but it definitely has changed the culture of the county.
You're absolutely right. We've seen really a decimation of the timber industry here in our county and in our entire Western North Carolina area. We have counties where 30, 40, 50, even 70 or 80% of the land is owned by the Forest Service. And we have had for generations people who have earned their living, as you said, as timber cutters. They cut timber. There were sawmills all over the place. Well, about 3, 4 years ago, the last sawmill in our county closed for lack of business. And there are people, because they're friends of mine. I know their families. I've lived here for over 40 years. These are people who had, like you said, they had a good life. They had a good living. They were able to afford good things and a nice home and a nice truck and things like that. But that is all gone. The cutting timber here for building that kind of quality timber, most of that is gone from here. And there's very little allowed because the Forest Service here is unfortunately not the friend of the people. One of the things, and I'm sure that you know about this, is one of the problems is that the forest, when you own that huge a percentage of land, when you own those huge acreages of land, you can't work them. You can't keep them up. You can't maintain them. You cannot do proper management. My suspicion is that's why fire is being used, because they're saying, I'm going to use fire to cover up the fact that I'm not getting in there and doing what I'm supposed to do. I don't know if you agree with that statement, but it kind of, from what you're saying, kind of rings true to me, because a lot of the forest roads are impassable. You can't get in and out. So if you want to recreate, you can't get in. If there's a wildfire, you can't get in and out. And we've had instances of that here where fire on Forest Service land was inaccessible. What's your comment on that?
Well, I totally agree with you, and it's really ironic, Dan, because the cradle of forestry is right near where you are, and the cradle of forestry is what it is. It's the cradle. It's where the profession, the North American profession of forestry started, and it started at the Vanderbilt estate, which was owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, was friendly with the Vanderbilts. Pinchot was sort of an American-based aristocrat, and had studied forestry. He's widely recognized as the first professional American forester, and went to school in Nancy, France, and came back and of all places was a consulting forester in New York City. And of course, that's where the Vanderbilts were from, and came down to North Carolina. And basically, what he did was he put um, a management plan together to manage the forest of the Vanderbilt estate. And as Pinchot worked through that, and then he left and moved on to other things, Carl Schenck came in. And Carl Schenck actually expanded the cradle of forestry by opening up a school. And Schenck was a German forester, and he taught young men the art of cruising timber, that is measuring timber, identifying the tree species, looking at the size of the tree to estimate the tree's volume, how many trees per acre. There's so many metrics that you can use to describe your forest. And Schenck put that in there, and it was all in North Carolina. And this wasn't happy-go-lucky type of stuff that happened in the Midwest, like the Lake States, Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, where timbering, okay, and I say that differently than forestry, because it was kind of cut and run at that time. You cut through it, and then you sold the land, and you moved on. This was to establish forestry, okay, and sustainability of those forests and improvement of those forests for timber for sure, but for wildlife, for fire protection, and watershed or water yield out of the forest. So there were a myriad of goals and objectives that these plans had. And it's North Carolina is one of the few states. There's a couple, but North Carolina has forests on the coast, which is out by Outer Banks, the Croatan. It's got the Uwharrie in the middle, okay, sort of like near Raleigh in that area, and then it's got the mountainous forest of the North Carolina Appalachian chain. And so it's forest. The forest and the Forest Service are big in North Carolina, and to not contribute to North Carolina's economy with a passive management plan, right? Not a plan that ensures local community economic growth and stability. And that's again, it becomes like the king's forest. Well, yeah, it's there, but we can't use it. and other than to take a hike maybe, but well, the road got washed out in the last hurricane. So, and they haven't rebuilt that road yet.
Well, that's really the problem we have here is if you look at the Forest Service roads, they're in complete disrepair. They're washed out. There's timber fall all over the place, blocking roads. And I can understand it would take an awful lot of manpower, which means a lot of money, to actually put the forests in the shape that they were meant to be. There's also deadfall in the forest, which is what contributes to forest fires or wildfires getting out of control. There's so much fuel for the fire lying on the ground it's just lying there because it's never been properly managed. It brings to mind a series of photos that I really love to talk about, the national forest. They were taken out west, and in 1909 there's a picture of a man on horseback in the national forest, and you could gallop at full gallop through the national forest on horseback at that time. And the series of pictures goes every decade up for about 40, 50, actually 60 or 70 years. And by the time that last picture is shown, he's there on horseback. I don't think there's any way he could even walk through the forest. That forest was a mess. Mm-hmm. And that it really demonstrates to me the government does not belong having control of things. I hate to say own, because they really shouldn't own the forest, but they should not be controlling things that they cannot manage. And that's what's happened. They keep taking land. They cannot manage the land they have, and yet they continually want more.
Avaricious on land. And our favorite president, okay, he contributed to that with putting there was a fund that came from the offshore outer continental shelf drilling revenues, and it was called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And that fund was subject to congressional appropriations yearly. And in order to help some Republican senators in Colorado and Montana, okay, the Land and Water Conservation Fund was put on automatic spending, which means that the Congress does not even debate the spending on the Land and Water Conservation Fund at all. It's like welfare for the land, if you will. Right. And, and the same thing with our welfare for humans. Right. That's off. That's just a mandatory spending program. And it goes up every year based on a formula. Rush Limbaugh used to talk about zero-based budgeting, if anybody ever paid attention to El Rushbo. And so it just keeps on going up. Well, that's the same thing that's going to happen with the Land and Water Conservation Fund. There's no brakes on it, and so every jurisdiction, from your little mayor, okay, in your small little town, they can apply for money to acquire local government land, and then of course the county can do that, and of course the state can do that, and then of course the feds do that, and in North Carolina. Which is a colonial state, okay, all the land was disposed of, so to speak. That was all private land. How North Carolina got its national forest was through the Weeks Act, and that came in 1911. But America, even back then, the United States, always evolved on a crisis, and so there was a huge fire bust in 1910. Burned nearly 3 million acres in Idaho, eastern Washington, and western Montana. And that was called the Big Burn. And it was that kind of publicity about that fire, where there were 78 fatalities in that fire. That was the kind of publicity that the Forest Service used to get the Weeks Act passed. And the Weeks Act had two things. One was to establish forest east of the 100th meridian, or generally the Mississippi River, and they were called acquired land, meaning that the Forest Service had to work, USDA had to work with the state legislature, get the state legislature to allow the feds to purchase land, and it was a purchase either through like people didn't pay their taxes, or someone was outright sales. And that's how the national forests in the East were established, especially in North Carolina. Although the Vanderbilts at that time were leaving North Carolina, and they donated the Pisgah National Forest to the United States under the Weeks Act. But then the second title of the Weeks Act was actually about cooperative fire prevention, and the North Carolina Weeks Act forests had to comply with Title II of the Weeks Act, and fire is really doubly not allowed in the North Carolina forest because first of all, the Organic Act of 1897 applied to the new national forest, and then the Weeks Act, which established them, said nope, fire is bad for the landscape and for the forest, for the watershed. And these forests were established for watershed protection to reduce flooding on navigable rivers and streams in the lowland areas. So that meant the major drainages that come through North Carolina, where like Raleigh or Charlotte or the big cities are in North Carolina, would kind of be protected in the upper watershed from the devastating floods.
So tell me, Joe, what consists for you As an expert in forestry and forest management, what is proper forest management? What should the government be doing outside of, in my view, divesting themselves of these lands because they're constitutionally they're not allowed to own all these lands. But I'm not even going to get into that.
Yeah,
So
that's a whole issue.
that's a whole issue because the Constitution says the federal government can own 10 square miles called Washington, D.C., post roads, post offices,
Mhm.
and military facilities. It doesn't go, it says that's it. And here we are with millions and millions of acres owned by the federal government, which should not have been allowed. But now that it's in existence, what is the proper forest management? What should we be requiring our federal government to do on our behalf?
Well, in a perfect world, Dan, that's easy for me to answer. The individual torts that people file against the Forest Service or other federal land management agencies, timber sales and so forth, that needs to be prohibited because that takes away certainty. Okay, and businesses like certainty, and you can't actually manage a forest without a business. You have to, it's like bacon and eggs. You can have bacon, you can have eggs, and when you eat them separately they don't taste that well. But when you have them combined, that's when you really have a great breakfast: bacon and eggs, and a cup of coffee, some good toast. That's a And so that I use that analogy to say that there has to be certainty so that business can invest and build a mill that is competitive in the world marketplace. Then those mills run anywhere from, on the cheap end, $30 million to $100 million, and then there should be a regulated supply of wood to those mills. And while you're taking out that wood, okay, you're also practicing conservation, and you're managing the fuels, as Dan had mentioned earlier, that are on the ground that in unmanaged forests build up and up and up, and then the only way they come out of the forest is through smoke. And I'd rather see the wood come out of the forest on a log truck. And so you need a public private sector thing. And then individually, for me, I would say that um, the, um, the state of North Carolina needs to have a bigger role in the management of the national forest in North Carolina, and maybe the primary role. If, as Dan says, he can't release these lands because of larger issues and so forth, then the state needs to have maybe even primary management of the national forest in North Carolina, with the Forest Service having secondary management, and that the management of the forest in North Carolina is set up to meet the needs of the rural communities and also the urban communities in the form of recreation, like rafting and skiing, if the limited amount of skiing there is in North Carolina, but fishing, all of those kinds of recreational opportunities that the forests do provide. But in order to get these forests in proper functioning condition, management is going to be needed, but the private sector is going to have to play a oversized role in doing that, and taking the wood out of the forest so that the forest can be thinned, and that, one of the goals of a forester is always thinking about the next generation of trees.
Well, let's talk about something. Let's switch subject for just a moment. You own a company,
Sure.
Flexus, and your job in that country is to advise homeowners and landowners how to protect themselves from wildfires and things of that nature. So you have, I'm sure, many clients who do live out in the woods, like I live out in the woods. Uh, But out west, as you were talking in California, where they went east in order to live up in the hills of the Sierras, and there are an awful lot of fires out there. And we know that there have been a number of fires where there's been serious loss of private property and loss of life. So, what do you counsel your clients? What do you tell them when they've had it, when they've suffered a loss? What do you tell them when you are concerned, when they are concerned that they might suffer a loss? What do you tell them to protect them? How do you deal with your clientele in these kind of circumstances?
Yeah, it's a great question on that, Dan. It's the best forest to have is a green forest, and you want to keep it that way, and you want your house to stay intact through a fire if one were to burn on your land. So there's a defensible space programs where close to the house you have gravel, no vegetation, and that would be about a 5 to 6 foot buffer right around the house. You would check your house for any cracks, and you would put in small screening on vents so that the flame or the embers can't get through on the house. And then after that 5 feet of stone around your house and with no vegetation in it, so you always got to be weeding that. Then you move out for the next 30 feet and you have limited vegetation and you have it spaced out, okay, so that it's not connected. It's not connected to each other. And so if one tree burns or one plant burns, it's not going to ignite its neighboring plant because they're further apart. And then the radiation heat won't get there, and there will be no conduction when they're together. That conduction is a form of spread. And then beyond that 30-foot interval out to 120 to 150 feet, you have the forest thinned, and you have that thinned to you want to keep all your species there except if they're invasive, but you want to have it thinned in clumps, so that there's always openings within that 150 feet of the house, that there's always some openings, so that if there is a running crown fire, it drops to the ground. And so that's the way to protect it. There are some chemical products and so forth that landowners and homeowners can apply, and they would have to be applied almost regularly. And then there's some high tech stuff that depending on your income, because this technology is very, very expensive, where you can open up through AI and computers water nozzles that spray around your house. But again, all of that stuff, as you know, that hardware and that software to put in, that becomes hugely expensive. And most of my clients aren't in that kind of income strategy. So we rely heavily on the vegetation management and keep things away from the house and so forth. And now I describe this whole defensible space as if it was flat land. If it's on a hillside where you're overlooking a hit on the top of a hill and you're overlooking a valley, then you have to thin even further down the slope, and so forth. So it for low cost, it's in, and for my client base, that's pretty effective on things. And then you hope that the firemen, when they get there, what I would expect is that my client's property under good management, and that's what I specialize in. And my clients have that property already thinned, and that there is no connecting crowns. There's groups of trees, and then there's openings, and the groups of trees are an acre to an acre and a half, and the openings are 3 times the size of that. So they're 3 acres, 2 acres to 3 acres, and the purpose of that is to drop fire back to the ground. and there are no fuels in these openings. And the idea of that is to get fire to drop to the ground, and then also those openings can be the basis for the next generation of forest. And you're not you're always keeping a forested landscape, but the forest is moving over time as the openings fill in. Then you create new openings in where there were previous clumps of trees, and that's how that works. So it's effective, and it's less expensive than all of the basic infrastructure that you would have to put in to bring water in there.
Well, that's very, very good advice. I mean, a lot of us in our county, of course, do live out in the woods, but a lot of people's homes are surrounded by dense forests, and I guess that's quite of a risk factor.
It is a huge risk factor.
And we're
So
also, of course, in a mountainous or hilly terrain, so that adds another factor. But there have been some fires, especially the ones involved in with the Forest Service that they have purposely enhanced or purposely set as prescribed burns. And people's homes have been damaged and lives have been lost. What kind of recourse, realistically, do they have?
not much at all, because you mentioned the limitation in the 11th Amendment and the court cases about sovereign immunity. Okay, and there have been a few cases. They happen to be in New Mexico where Congress stepped in and waived immunity. And the first case that I'll mention was in the year 2000, and that was the Cerro Grande fire, which was in Bandelier National Monument. And Bandelier National Monument is along the south boundary of the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. And the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory is the national lab that perfected the atom bombs that were dropped on Japan to end World War II. And that fire was lit in May of 2000. It burned 48,000 acres in a wind-driven fire. The winds were 75 miles an hour at top gusts, and it blew that fire through the Los Alamos Nuclear Lab, and it was quite a disaster. And you would have thought that there would be a pause on prescribed burning after that, but and that was a prescribed burn. And I actually think that's not the right name for it. It's a controlled burn, and that's an oxymoron, because you can't control fire, because fire is controlled by the weather and the fuels. So there's a triangle for a fire to burn, and the humans can't do much about it, especially if they haven't managed the one thing that they can do, and that is manage the fuels. But that fire burned through, and Congress passed the Cerro Grande Fire Recovery Act, and had FEMA administer, Federal Emergency Management Agency, administer the compensation for the loss that people suffered. And then also in 2022, same state, New Mexico, same national forest, because the Los Alamos Lab, the Bandelier National Monument, and the Santa Fe National Forest are all adjoining neighbors. So that Cerro Grande fire burned through all three of those federal jurisdictions. Over on the east side of the Santa Fe, in the town of Las Vegas, the city of Las Vegas, New Mexico, a fire was lit in April. We're coming up on it. It was lit on April 6th, and on April 6th, that fire ran 8,000 acres a day it was lit, and was completely out of what they call prescription, if you could ever prescribe something. And Dan, I know you're a medical doctor, so right, when you prescribe medicine for your clients, for your patients, right? You're looking at their weight, you're looking at their age, you're looking at a whole lot of factors, and you're looking at the efficacy of that pharmaceutical. Would that be the right prescription to give that patient? Well, when you say a prescription for forestry, that again is sort of oxymoronic too, but that's the terms that are used. And then that fire that was lit in 2022 was the Las Despensas prescribed burn. And as soon as it escaped, they named it the Hermit's Peak fire. Well, to the north, to the west, southwest of Hermit's Peak was Calf Canyon. And Calf Canyon, on the same ranger district, the Pecos Las Vegas Ranger District, piles were lit. So these were slash piles that were piled sort of teepee style, and those piles were lit in January, and they burned. And the job of the Forest Service fire crews during the winter was to go out and manage those piles, to monitor them, right? And in order to monitor them, you got to get out of the engine and off of the phone, and you have to go out and you have to stick your hand without gloves on it over the fire, just like when you're camping, and you got to feel for the heat. And they failed to do that. And in April is funny. It was Earth Day, April 22nd. That these very, very high winds came up, similar to the same kind of winds that lit or blew the fire, the burn in 2000 into the National Lab, into Los Alamos. Those winds came up, and that started it blew the pile burn fires alive, and that ended up combining with the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. It burned 341,000 acres of land. To give you perspective on what 341,000 acres is, it's about half the size of the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island's about 760,000 acres, and 341,000 is approximately half of that. And the fire burned 171,000 of those 341,000 acres on private land, on folks that were not. Some folks were as far as 18 miles from where the fire started, and lost their property through the fire. And so, those are huge acreages. And again, Congress stepped in and they mirrored the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Recovery Act right after the Los Alamos Act, and again put FEMA in charge. And it's not going well. Just the other day, there was a headline in the local paper in Las Vegas called The Optic, where the administrator for the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Recovery Fund paid him and his wife $550,000 for smoke damage, while some of our clients and some of our friends, Dan, know that they haven't been paid yet. And that's, I'm looking at you crying here about government is the moral and constitutional basis for freedom, right? And these people lost their property under the Fifth Amendment, and there's no morality in these in these acts that Congress passes, because there's so much red tape with them that you can't actually get fully compensated. And I'll stop here for a minute, and we can talk.
Well, I think that you've given us a pretty good picture of many aspects of forestry that I'm very happy that you were able to talk with us about. And you're right about the crawl on the bottom, the right to own private property that cannot be arbitrarily confiscated or regulated by the government is the moral and constitutional basis for individual freedom. That's why we're talking about property. And many of the subjects that we cover here on Freedom Forum Live are various aspects of private property and how the government tries to take that away from us. Because the fewer people who own private property, or when you don't own private property, you're easy to control. If you own private property, you cannot be controlled. That's an axiom of government. And all governments, unfortunately, they desire to get bigger and stronger because men are greedy and have a lust for power. And that's what we're fighting at this point in our history in this country. We were given a constitutional republic that was a gem in its time, and it would have been a gem today had it not been demolished by greed and people who only could see power for themselves. And you could see that today, where you run for Senate and you'll spend $200 million to get a job that pays $175,000 a year. That is not what I would call. That's just it's just obvious that
I
there's
call
greed
it the best
involved there.
government money can buy.
Yeah, that is the best government that money can buy. But
Right.
give us instead of talking about that right now, what are your closing thoughts about the forests, their value, and what we should be doing from now on?
Well, sure. Just want to address something that you said about, governments and so forth. The Forest Service came out of the progressive era. TR was a major progressive, and the progressives came out of and the Republican Party was progressive then, right? It came out of the anti-slavery movement, and that movement then went on from the anti-slavery movement in the North, winning, I don't even call it winning, okay, because we were killing each other, okay, but the settlement of the Civil War, all right, 650,000 Americans died in that Civil War, okay, and we're crying about 6 people, and I don't mean to make light of this, who perished in Iran today. Or through this whole bit of hostilities. But the concept then it then went on to banning alcohol, right? Which ended up with crime. But going back to Roosevelt and Pinchot, they were progressives, right? And they thought that the government could run these simple operations like forestry and logging and that kind of stuff. They thought they could run it better than private sector. Private sector, ends up being better. There's 490 million acres of non-industrial private forest land. That means private property. It's not connected to any government, city, state, county, feds. 490 million acres of those woodlands in the United States. A large degree are managed either through the state subsistence forestry that helps private landowners or private consultants like myself that are fee-for-service type folks. But it's better managed than the federal government. 90% of our timber that we domestically consume comes from the non-industrial private forest lands of the United States. But the forests are more they're invaluable, okay? Because it's not just timber, right? It's the ecosystem services that forests provide. Okay, they capture water in snow. They trickle it down through little streams that become large rivers. They fill the water supply. They provide recreation opportunities for folks. They provide wildlife habitat. They provide, carbon dioxide sequestration. There's a lot of, and that concept, that's the new concept of forestry is ecosystem services. And part of ecosystem services is timber, right? But it's not the whole thing. But ecosystem services is what forests provide. Federal forests, private forests, any forest provides that. It provides a level of ecosystem services that are important on this planet. So the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the potassium cycle, all of these cycles are essential to living here on this planet, right? And the bottom line on this planet is either you dig it or you grow it. Otherwise, we don't have it. And so we have to manage these forests that way, and we have to think about them as ecosystem service providers. When you apply fire, okay, and the federal government is not good at doing this. I mean, we talked about Cerro Grande, we talked about Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon. There's another one I didn't mention, Cerro Pelado, 48,000 acres, almost burned into the Cerro Grande fire. There's the Mack Lake fire in Mack Lake, Michigan in 1980. Killed 2 people. That was for the Kirtland's warbler. It became a huge conflagration. There's a little known one in Utah, the Sanford burn, and all of these managers of these fires, okay, for both Forest Service and Park Service, all got promoted. They all got promoted. I mean, and so there's no consequence for this kind of nonsense. But you can't have ecosystem services in a burn. Okay, those ecosystem services are gone. Now, it's not devoid of wildlife because it's an opening, so you'll get some big ungulates that come in there, and like the elk and so forth, and you'll get early cereal species of birds and animals that live in there until the habitat grows and changes and develops, like that picture you were talking about, from 1909 to 1990, right? Where if the guy tried to run his horse through the forest, he'd be knocked off of it. So we have to look, we have to value these forests, and we can't just have single type of use. And that's the failure of the federal system. One silver bullet in Washington, D.C. stops the whole operation. And so we have to divest. We have to divest. I would actually, Dan, this is time for another show, but I think there's a lot of merit to states taking over the forest or even selling them, and so forth, with some maybe some conservation easements on them to allow public use. But I really do think we have to divest ourselves of the Washington, D.C. monoculture that we have about, only the federal government can do conservation. Well, no, most of the national forests are overgrown. Okay, they have too many silly rules and regulations because every president wants to have a conservation legacy. A couple of years ago, I visited Arkansas, and I went to President Clinton's library, as Rush always affectionately called it, his library and massage parlor. And so he had a big map of the United States, right? And he was burnishing his credentials as a conservation president, and he was showing all the inventoried roadless areas on the national forest. You could push a button for the state of North Carolina, and about 13 of them would show up. And we need to manage this stuff and not hold it out as this is sacred land, you can't do anything with it, because we need all the land we can, and we need all the ecosystem services that we can. Just for our own health and well-being. And so I say forests are more than just the timber, but the burning of it is really detrimental to all of the other assets that forests provide. The burning pollutes water. Okay, it causes erosion, right? Because when a forest burns, you get an effect called hydrophobicity. So the lignin in the plant, okay, forms a waxy sheen over the forest. You can't see it with your eyes, but it's there. And then with no canopy anymore, because the canopy is all burned out, there's no in intense rainstorms, there's no filtering and protection of the pelting raindrops falling on the ground. And then because of the hydrophobicity, that water flows off the surface. And as it flows, it picks up speed and starts to cut into the soil and causes huge gullies and so forth. And once the soil is lost, right, there's no way you're ever going to get the soil up on the hill again. Okay, that's an irretrievable, an irreversible loss of the productivity of that soil, because that soil had inherent productivity, had the right amount of cations, had the right amount of organic matter, it had the right depth of soil where roots could puncture through and spread out. It had all of that, those assets, they were all gone. They're down in the creek. And then in the creek, you can't drink that water and the fish are all dead, right? So fire is an unraveling of these ecosystem services.
Well, Joe Redden, you've just summed up for me as the best summary I have yet heard about how the forest, the importance of forests in our overall, to our country in every aspect of our life. And the several takeaways from that is that the government is incapable of properly managing anything and does not come close to private industry. I'm a free market guy, and the free market wins every single battle with government every single time. And a subset of that, of course, is we got to end the roadless rule. That's another thing we didn't talk about. But bottom line is the forests are part of our entire ecosystem, and we're part of the ecosystem too.
We are.
The cities are part of it. We all are dependent upon that symbiotic life of plants, animals, humans, and how we all live together. And there's just no excuse for using fire as a tool of destruction and a tool to steal land from the public. So, Joe Redden, thank you very much for being a guest on Freedom Forum Live. You nailed it.
Well, Dan, thank you. Thank you for having me. I would like to say one more thing. And, this is a cowboy hat, not a tinfoil hat. But seriously, I think part of the culture of fire in Washington, D.C. is to drive people out of what they call the urban wild interface, make it so uncomfortable for them to live there. You've heard of the Buffalo Commons, where people live in the cities, and all these lands are vacant. You've heard of the Wildlands Project. I mean, these are and we can read about them in books. And Agenda 21. We can read about these things, right? But I really do think, when you look at the synthesis of this whole thing, fire is a way to get people off the land. And disgusted.
It is one of the tools. It is one of the tools, along with everything else that they're doing to try to make it impossible to live on your private property in a rural area.
Yep.
We feel it. We feel it here in rural North Carolina, and I'm sure all rural people are feeling that the government is against us, and they have a whole bunch of tools. And it's time for us, you and I and our compatriots, to stand up and say, no, you're not going to drive us off our land. You're not going to steal our land. We have the right to live on our land. You do not have the right to own it and take it away from us.
Or limit it.
Good night, Joe Redden, and thank you very much for being a guest. It's been great.
It was my honor to come here, and I'll come back again.
I hope so. Thank you, and good night now.
Good night. Bye.